Nice to see you all here. I'm going to be the moderator of this evening Institute talk. And let me introduce myself first. I'm Nelida Fuccaro, and I'm an historian of the modern Middle East, teaching here at NYU Abu Dhabi. And for years I've worked on the urban history of this region. So that is the connection with the book that we are going to discuss today. This evening, we're going to have a mix of presentations by the two authors, Roberto Fabbri and Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi. But also, we are going to have a conversation and followed by the Q&A. The title of this session is Urban Modernity in the Contemporary Gulf, Obsolescence and Opportunities. And this is the title of the book edited by Roberto Fabbri and Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi, which was published by Routledge in 2022. So it's basically just fresh out of the press. Let me introduce, first of all, the two speakers, the two editors, shall I say, as well. First of all, let me introduce Roberto Fabbri, who's an architect, a researcher, and associate professor at Zayed University. As a former UNDP consultant, he participated to the rehabilitation of several concrete buildings in Kuwait, including the Kuwait National Museum and the former American Mission Hospital. His academic research revolves around the notion of narrative spaces and include different forms of heritage and museum building. Heritage being, obviously, as we shall see later on, a very important theme of this book. And Roberto has primarily worked on a non-Western context. Roberto is also part of the newly founded UAE chapter of the Documentation and Conservation of the Building of the Modern Movements and a member of the UAE Modern Heritage Technical Committee. He co-authored the double-volume Modern Architecture in Kuwait, 1949-1989, and also he edited, and I guess authored as well, an article in the History of Post-War Architecture journal, a special issue called Impatient Cities of the Gulf. And of course, alongside with Sultan al-Qassemi, he has edited the book that we are going to discuss this evening. I actually met Roberto years ago in Kuwait when he was doing his work on Kuwaiti architecture. Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi perhaps does not need much introduction, but I'll do what I can this evening. Sultan is an Emirati columnist and researcher on social, political, and cultural affairs in the Arab Gulf states. He's also the founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation, an independent initiative established in 2010. Hi, Sultan. I see he's joined us from Berlin. To contribute to the intellectual development of the art scene in the Arab region. He has taught politics of modern Middle Eastern art at New York University, at Yale, Georgetown, and Boston College, the American University of Paris, Columbia University, and currently at Bard College in Berlin. Sultan is also currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, and it is from here that he's going to join our conversation. Welcome, Sultan. Now, I will leave the platform to Sultan, who's going to briefly introduce the book and the work they've done on the book.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I wish I was there with you. I can see that the room has some familiar faces, and it's always good to be speaking with my colleague and dear friend, Roberto Fabbri. I'll give you a brief overview of this book that Roberto, in fact, invited me to co-edit with him about 2018. We initially started working on this book And the book really was a culmination of a number of meetings that Roberto Fabbri and I had in Kuwait and elsewhere, talking about the importance of documenting modern architecture in the Gulf region, but also through the eyes and the lenses of professionals and experts and witnesses to this change, which is why I think this book is quite fascinating. And before I move to the next slide, I just want to draw your attention to this building that features on the cover of the book, because I will reference this structure coming up in a few slides. The book is divided really into three major parts. One part is almost sort of looking back at what's been published and what's been written and how modern architectural heritage was developed in the Gulf region. The second part, we're looking at the international expertise that has played a role in planning and developing these cities, but also looking at the local expertise and links, which is something I think that is still understudied. So we look at it in more than one chapter, but it is another topic I think that's worth plenty of discussion. And finally, we look at the idea of heritage, because modern architecture is more than just the concrete buildings that were developed in the Gulf in the mid-20th century. There's so much that goes into this that I think that it's worth expanding the understanding of what heritage is. We were lucky enough to be hosted in the last Gulf research meeting in 2019, of course, before the pandemic. And as you can see, we have had a number of interesting speakers from various ages, younger, older, more established, and also novices to the field. Now, I told you to think about the first building that's on the cover. By the way, that photo was taken by Roberto Fabbri, and that is not me on the cover. Everyone keeps asking me if that was the case. But the reason I draw your attention to that building is that building was designed by a British firm called the Design Construction Firm. Well, British really is, it was founded by two Brits, but it was based in Beirut, in Lebanon, in the Middle East. It was founded there in the 1950s by Irving and Jones, two British architects, but it employed dozens of Arab and Middle Eastern architects. It was based in the Middle East. It worked in the Middle East. And this is one of their structures that they designed in Sharjah, a building that no longer exists. That was the former headquarters of Crescent Petroleum. And this, I think, is an ideal way to think about the book, because when you speak to someone and you say this firm was founded by two architects, the first instinct is to think of them as a Western firm. But in reality, this firm that spent over 25 years in the Gulf region, in the Middle East, designing projects in Lebanon, in Qatar, in the Emirates, and elsewhere, this is very much a Middle Eastern company, which I think is very important to think when you think about the issue of authorship and whether these are Western companies or Middle Eastern companies or local companies that have designed these firms. And I also want to draw your attention to another project that we speak about in this book, which I'm very also attached to, because this is an airport that was constructed in Sharjah in the early 20th century, I think in the 1920s or so. And as you can see on the right side of this image, you see corals, unfortunately, but also mud brick, wood, and maybe what some people refer to as rudimentary raw materials. But also when you look at this building, you see that the building includes modern equipment. It was an airport, so there was electronic devices, but you also see glass, aluminum, concrete, cement, and steel. And so this really is an example of a structure that defies the idea of what modern architecture is in the Gulf. Modern architecture, for most of us, we think of as architecture of the 1950s and 60s, but this takes you back a generation earlier, and it still exists today. And we feature this in one of the essays in the book. Now, I'm very proud of our book. I think we did a decent job, but in reality, there was a lot missing in our book. And I think it's important to be humble and to recognize what we missed out on. And I believe that a country as diverse and rich architecturally as Oman is one of our sort of more glaring missings from the book. So you're looking at here a structure on the right that was designed by John Harris, who is a name that is familiar to a lot of us who have lived in the UAE. The person behind the Dubai master plan, as Todris has written in a book recently. So I think that Oman, for example, and is something that is very much that we missed. But we recognize that we missed it. And I think this is an opportunity for many other researchers to look at the Gulf region. But I want to say as well that a lot of young scholars or young individuals in the Gulf have started initiatives looking at modern architecture, and they're not necessarily professional experts or scholars and academics. These are individuals who love modern architecture, and they're playing an important role. And this is something else that needs to be reflected. Since the publishing of the book, Saudi Arabia has played host to a major Islamic arts biennial that's ongoing. And I think this is a prime example of the structures that we talk about in the book. The King Abdulaziz International Airport in Jeddah that was designed in the late 70s and been repurposed today into an art space. And I think that this is an example of a structure that was repurposed, but in a very intelligent way, safeguarding the original structure, but also giving the building another life and another purpose. And I think expanding the audience of this building that was really, in many ways, only accessible to Muslim immigrants. And now you have people from various faiths who can visit and enjoy this structure. I think that it's also important to think about other sources of documentation. Yes, scholars and professionals are very important, but myself, somebody who's interested in modern art, I think it's important to look at artists as also sources of documentation. Here you see a Saudi artist based in the Eastern Province, Abdurrahman Al-Suleiman, documenting through his photographs, but also through his paintings, images of modern architecture and also destruction of modern architecture, as you can see in the bottom right. The painting, of course, the title is Al-Atlal, and many of you who understand Arabic know the significance of that word in the Arabic language. I won't stop at this work, but this is the painting very briefly of Saudi artist Safiya bin Zagr looking at Al-Balad, which is the historic district of Jeddah, and the UAE's very own Abdul Qadir al-Rayis throughout the 1980s, talking about modern structures, early modern structures, and also giving them very powerful names, like the title of the work on the left, Decay, which I feel for him is a reference to obsolescence, a reference to neglect of some of these structures. Artists like Brahim Ismail, who have documented modern structures in Kuwait that today are really under threat. And we've seen this very structure that I'm about to show you the next slide that experienced a fire just a year or two ago. And I think once again that even going back a few decades, you find images of the original shape of that building through the paintbrush of artists and photographers. I also want to say finally that in addition to artists, in addition to bloggers, in addition to young writers, we see in the Gulf the emergence of a new genre of architectural documentation. And this is a movie called Beit Abui, which won an award, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of years ago, again, showing you beautiful architectural monuments. The movie is short, but very, very moving, about an opportunity that a family had where they would destroy their home and turn it into a coffee shop. And we've seen these instances plenty times in the Gulf. And so finally, I want to show you that even in the Arabic press, it's not only in the English language or the English-speaking world in the Gulf, but even in the Arabic language world, you see people writing articles wanting to conserve modern architectural heritage of the Gulf. Here you see a Saudi writer, and on the right, a poet thinking about the importance of preserving modern architecture, which is something we try to do in our book. Thank you.
Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you for having me here today. Thanks to the NYU Institute for making this event possible, NYUAD for coordination, and Nelida for being with us tonight, and thank you all for coming. So in continuation with Sultan's presentation, my talk today will try to offer some points of reflection on the book's themes and some visual content taken from the chapters. One of the main constraints that we had during the preparation of the publication was the limited number of images allowed by the format. I guess there were 64, 65. So together with the other contributors, we had to pick and choose carefully each image to complement the chapter's narrative. So today is also an opportunity to highlight the part of the visual content of the book. And also those images that didn't make it to the page, and contextually to extract a few topics and common threads that hopefully will foster the debate at the end of our presentations. So you have seen this already. This is our book cover, and I still think that this could be Sultan, because I didn't meet you when I took this shot. All right, so it has to be mentioned that the book includes an article, a great introduction by Kishwar Rishvi from Yale University that cleverly titled Forms of Engagement, and 4 endorsements by Nasser Rabat, Amel Andraus, Pascal Menoret, who was a former here at NYUAD, and Ashraf Salama. The book intentions revolve around the 4 terms in the title, which are in apparent opposition: modernity, contemporaneity, obsolescence, opportunities. In other words, we wanted to read the legacy of the modernization project in today's Gulf cities. And also we wanted to read the potential of these obsolete structures for the future of the urban fabrics in the region. So when Sultan and I started this project, our attention was caught by a series of initiatives pointing towards the preservation of modernist architecture in the GCC. It was 2018, Sultan was working on building Sharjah. I was almost finished. I finished the other books on Kuwait. And we read the news about Dubai's municipality's intention to protect a few selected buildings from the 1970s, namely John Harris World Trade Center, Jafar Tukan's prototype kindergarten, the clock towers, roundabout, and others. It was one of the rare occasions in which the word modern and the word heritage were pronounced in the same sentence in an official governmental statement. In the last decade, new tangible interest for those artifacts has grown stronger, as demonstrated by a variety of new studies and initiatives, scholarly research, publication, in addition to students' work, as well as exhibitions, artist work, public debates, and a few placemaking campaigns, demonstrate a rising and compelling need to re-engage with the concrete city of the 1960s and 70s. In this sense, it's indicative that the new Qatar National Museum was inaugurated in March 2018, showcasing a temporary exhibit titled Making Doha, 1950-2030, that put in perspective the recent architectural successes of the country, such as the museum itself, along with the early modern structure of the post-oil discovery era. The book stems from our common interest in those topics, but also is not a retrospective. We wanted to avoid nostalgic and idealized memories of the past on the one hand, and to advocate for preservation on the other. We have started studying the architecture of the Gulf 13 years ago, and during the past decade, so many buildings from the modernization era have been demolished because they were deemed not sufficiently authentic, because they were considered obsolete, or simply because they existed in central plots that were very attractive to real estate developers. The book also reflects on a third way, called museumification, or the transformation of an old container into a cultural center or an exhibition venue. This solution is a usual practice for ancient buildings, and it does preserve the heritage in danger. But the number of museums in one city is limited, and the structure from this period are high in numbers. Two examples here in the slide. On your left, Doha Fire Station, or, quote, Doha leading contemporary art space. And on your right side, Sharjah Flying Saucer, a space-age restaurant from 1978 acquired by Sharjah Art Foundation and later transformed into a cultural hub and reopened in 2020. There are the other examples in the region, like the terminal that we've seen before, the Hajj terminal. Another example could be Manama's Custom House, which is the protagonist of another chapter in the book and is also a cultural center now, but in between it was a post office. So in this framework, the book reflects on what can be a foreseeable future for the modern heritage in the Gulf, advocating for preservation as an answer to a number of specific issues of the contemporary urban environment, locally and globally, that I'm briefly going to discuss here in the following slides. Preservation reduces the urban sprawl and the land consumption. The State of the Arab Cities report here in the slides by UN Habitat, UNDP, and the Bahraini Center for Strategic International Energy Studies is considered one of the most comprehensive snapshots that assesses the status of urbanization in the Arab region. The analysis is conducted in alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 11, which assesses the impact of overpopulation in urban centers. In this sense, in 2020, the 2020 report shows concern for the continued expansion of the Arab cities' footprint due to urban drift and migration dynamics. These two factors are predicted to bring 2/3 of the population living in cities by the middle of this century. The Gulf is already leading the regional ranking with 80% of the population in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and UAE living in urban areas, and the figure rising up to 98 in Kuwait and 99 in Qatar. Preservation reduces also the ecological footprint generated by the demolition activities and the rubbles that to be disposed in landfills. It has been recently calculated that 8% of the total CO2 emission globally is for the production of new construction materials such as steel, bricks, and concrete. Gulf cities should reconsider the already existing building stock, which on many occasions is either obsolete, underused, or abandoned, as an opportunity for localized intervention and participative efforts to bridge urban divides and stitch a discontinuous urban fabric. The act of preserving and reimagining a new life for an old part of the city is not only a more efficient and ecological practice, but also represent the continuation of the cultural experiences through the preservation of memories. A culture of reuse, especially in a highly consumeristic site much like the Gulf, cannot be achieved overnight. It can only be built by an accumulative process made of studies, debates, and conferences, artist work, public awareness campaign, training of young professionals, state-led plans, and bottom-up initiatives, as we try to showcase in our book. As the Gulf City is in constant transformation, 20th century structure rapidly become outmoded, and that has led to a marginalization of these areas. In many occasions, these places are opportunities of informal gatherings for other citizenships. Reflecting on abandoned or underused parts of the city, as well as industrial zones and outdated commercial areas, the book investigates liminal spaces as a product of the modernization and as a possible arena of opportunities to make the contemporary city more just. So with this in mind, the book presents 13 episodes of modernity in the contemporary city, attempting a work-in-progress, cross-country definition of what can be considered the modern heritage for the Gulf, and what role this building stock plays or could play in today's urban strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both speakers. This has given us a sense of the publication, of the ideas behind it. And, you know, in many respects, the urban fabric that was produced during the modernization era had long been forgotten. Before academics and practitioners like yourselves have started working on it. What I actually do like about this book and the two talks, that we get really a clear sense that this book is also being put together thinking about a future research and active agenda. As in a sense, both of you said, you know, there is much more to be done. There are clear omissions and so forth. We couldn't cover everything. I guess one of the arguments of the book, I guess, of the publication is the modernist architecture has the potential to narrate to us contemporary viewers, social growth, and all series of cultural, social, and political dynamics, but above all, citizens' memories of the past across the region. So there is this big theme of memory in this book that is very important, which brings me to the issue of heritage that actually occupies, I think, part 3 of the edited volume. Of course, you know, let me start with a brief reflection on the book's title, which I found intriguing at the beginning, this whole idea of obsolescence and opportunity, and this idea of being obsolete, as Sultan was saying, being neglected, in decay, but also being somehow of no use, or I think out of fashion, outmoded, and so forth. And it's a very kind of intriguing way of start discussing this whole idea of heritage. Now, I want to push both of you a bit more on the idea of this modernist architecture has heritage, and the kind of meaning of heritage in this context, that you think this architecture, if used in appropriate way and through the development of a culture of reuse, which is obviously very important in this part of the world as elsewhere. I just want to push you a bit on this idea of heritage as historical memories, a symbol of what?
Would you like me to answer that?
Well, whoever wants to.
You start.
Well, I think that heritage in the Gulf is very much alive. In the Gulf, you see people who still wear the traditional clothes, the thob, the tishtasha, the kandora. The women still wear the abaya. The Gulf states have been very much attached to their heritage. We still greet each other in our own way. We still carry on traditions. Even in the 21st century, I think in the UAE and the other Gulf states, we are some of the most advanced countries in terms of adopting technology. But at the same time, we're very much attached to our heritage, our national identity. And so I think that this seeps not only into our colloquial, daily spoken culture, but also into our heritage. We very much value the buildings that were constructed in the early 20th century. But something happens in the mid-20th century where, for some reason or the other, we felt, I think, especially towards the late 90s and 2000s, that these buildings were of less value because they were not authentic enough. But I feel that there is a revival now in individuals who believe that structures that were built in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s are part and parcel of our identity. You see them featured in our currency, in our stamps, even in our daily, sometimes discussions. People refer to the Trade Center in Dubai, and they refer to the Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi. This has become part of our the daily interactions with the city. And so, yes, heritage can take a different meaning, I think, in the Gulf, especially when you consider how attached we are to our own heritage.
Thank you very much. Let me just, yes, I mean, I totally agree with you. Of course, heritage is very important, but I think in some ways, and I know you're fully aware because you said it, that you are actually starting to add to what was considered to be traditionally heritage, because I'm a scholar of oil in the Gulf, and in some ways, recently it has changed, but somehow the pre-oil era was the kind of the center stage of what was considered heritage. And you guys, you're starting obviously a new phase that it seems to me very, very important here. So this idea of the modern, the early modern, architecturally and otherwise, as part of the heritage of this part of the world and of this nation. Roberto, sorry.
No, just one reflection on following what Sultan was saying, and the Gulf is not unique in this. The Gulf belongs to planet Earth and is pretty much following the same dynamics that happened before, not before, but contextually in other parts of the world. The concrete architecture is the misfit of architecture everywhere. Before moving in the Gulf, I was trying to, with other colleagues, young, dreamy graduate from the School of Architecture, to preserve a modern building in my hometown in Italy from Ponti, which is a famous architect from the 50s and before. But nobody pay attention to that building. Nobody find value in that. The Heritage Authority, which in Italy is an institution, I mean, it's big. The officers there, they were struggling finding interest in this kind of structure because it was not in their format. Okay, there must be another castle, there must be another church to be taken care of before taking care of this concrete building. So all of a sudden in early 2000, there's been, because there was a threat to demolish a Le Corbusier building in France. So all of a sudden, all the architects in the world start saying, no, you don't touch Le Corbusier because it's impossible to demolish a building from there. So that somehow, because of the authorship of these buildings, it started a movement, let's say, to protect this building or start restarting this building. And there's no problem in protecting a building from Le Corbusier. Everybody is happy with that. But when it comes to Tony Irving and Gordon Jones, for example, which is the building Sultan was talking about, which are unknown by the majority of people, there is where you don't find interest, you don't find research, you don't find money to research and to preserve this building. So the dynamic we're seeing now in the Gulf is going towards this direction. It's scholars, but people are way more aware of the importance of these buildings. Not necessarily because they are famous piece of architecture, but because they are part of a transition that transform the built environment, but also the society after the discovery of the oil.
Thank you. You've you said the magic word, authorship, that I wanted to mention now as my second point to both guests here. Now, I mean, the whole idea, we are talking about architecture, but we are also talking about cities and urban environment, urban lives and urban residents and so forth. So architecture, in a sense, is part of a much broader mosaic of things and activities that make up the city. You know, you can think about practitioners of different types being involved in the production of buildings, but also in the production of cities. So architects are one, builders, urban planners, technicians, and so forth. So in a sense, the production of architecture requires quite a lot of technical knowledge, and the production of the city, for that matter, and expertise. So, and I think, Sultan, in your presentation, you mentioned the issue of authorship. You know, you mentioned British firm established in Beirut, but with a lot of Middle Eastern employees, architects, and so forth. Now, I am wondering, this debate is obviously fascinating, and you know, just to broaden it out, is actually not a debate that is very much happening here in the Gulf, but everywhere, about this idea of the contemporary city, right? Or what is this contemporary city? Is local, imported, is Western, or what? And particularly in this part of the world, I have to say, it's obviously a very important debate. So there is this big issue of Gulf architecture and Gulf urban making in relation to the issue of Western expertise versus Eastern expertise. Now, I mean, I'm wondering, is this kind of East-West reasoning correct, the way to go about it? Or perhaps there is something different that we could think about? So I'll leave it to you.
If I may, I don't think it's a matter of verses. I think it's a matter of and. It's a matter of... Right. These are Arab architects who studied in Europe, who studied in North America, who came back and worked. These are Western companies who came to the Middle East, who hired Arabs, who worked in the Middle East. So I don't think it's a matter of this is a structure that's, you know, this is the West and this is East, and there's an ocean of difference between them. Many of them have interacted with the same structures. Many of them have interacted with the same professors. And I think the idea of the globalization of knowledge goes back earlier than the 21st century. It's not the product of the internet age, the democratization of knowledge. I think that many individuals work together, as our chapter on Qatar talks about. Many individuals clashed and changed. And then you really can't assign a single authorship to a giant structure or a giant city. And I always think of the example of Halpro. Well, Halpro is a giant British company that was founded, I think, in the 19th century. And if they laid the master plan of Sharjah, who is Halpro? Is there a Mr. Halpro? Who's the person who would design the master plan? So it's most likely an amalgamation of more than one architect and more than one urban professional. And even in the city of Abu Dhabi, when you think of Abu Dhabi has at least 2 or 3 different master plans that all came together and worked together. And by the way, one of them was Western, one of them was East Asian, Japanese, and one of them was Egyptian. And so you're looking at people from 3 different continents who come together and put the city of Abu Dhabi really under the leadership and under the auspices of the ruler of Abu Dhabi, of our late President Sheikh Zayed, Allah yarham. So it's very important to know that these are all individuals who interacted together. So it wasn't one versus the other. Otherwise, nothing will work.
I totally agree with you. I mean, perhaps I did not explain myself correctly. But I still think, though, that this idea of heritage, going back to, the discussion we had before, somehow implies an idea of authenticity. And therefore, going back to the question of authorship, is a tricky issue, actually. And I mean, I think it's something that I have been discussing in this region in different contexts for a long time. This issue, and that's why I think it's so interesting in relation to your topic of study, this modernist architecture. Roberto.
Yeah, I was thinking about a map that we did for, not for this book, for the book on Kuwait. And I think 3rd, 4th page, there's a spread that shows a map that has more or less Kuwait in the center. And they are the rest of the world around, and they are trajectories of architects and firms and practices that came to work to Kuwait in the time span that we were analyzing in that book, and it's interesting because you see they are converging to this very little patch of land in the representation of the globe, and you have trajectories coming from all over the world, because in 50 years there have been firms attracted to work there literally from all over the world. And also, it's probably wrong to think this dichotomy East and West, because there's no one West, there's no one East, and there's no one West. I mean, hiring a Japanese urban planner and an American corporate firm is not the same thing. You don't have the same result at the end. You don't have the same interaction with these experts that Sheikh Zayed hired at that time. It's an example, but there's plenty of them. So the decision of going with one planner or another planner, with a consultant, another consultant, a contractor or another contractor, changed completely the final result. And you're right, there's more to talk about that, but there's the tendency lately in like giving passports to ideas, giving passport to buildings, which is impossible, and it's stupid in its essence. I mean, is the Burj Khalifa a local building? Of course it is, but is the steel that built the Burj Khalifa local? Of course it's not. The expertise, the author of the Burj Khalifa, I bet 1,000 people have worked in drawing the technical details for that construction. And on top of that, you have 10,000 people from any nationalities that came to build it, to make it happen. So who's the father or the mother of that building at the end? No? But there's a tendency lately, especially in academia, to go after these narratives and trying to define that something is local if it is somehow attached to a local person or local designer or I don't know if you agree with me, Sultan.
Sultan.
I actually want to add a point. When we were doing research for building Sharjah, we came across 2 buildings, Nelida, that we have a record, a document from the municipality, signed, stamped, official document, stating that the name of the architect of this building is such and such. Okay, so this is fine. We could have taken that paper and ran with it. We would have been fine. However, after doing oral interviews with the owners of the building, we found out that in the 1970s, when the UAE was very, very young, there was a lot of architectural companies that didn't care to open offices in the Emirates because there wasn't that much work. So what they did, Nelida, was that they hired architects of record in the UAE. So this building was on the record attributed to a local architectural company. However, the original architect was based in Beirut or based in Cairo. These are actual examples in the book. So it's very important not to take things at face value. And even if you have a document, it's important to investigate behind the scenes of a certain building, which is, I think, something that comes up in this book as well.
Yes, it's fascinating, particularly that particular period, the 60s and the 70s, and the plot thickens. You know, we are like detectives trying to connect all this, these threads. You got anything to add to this, Roberto?
No,
so I'm aware of time, and I could continue to ask questions. I have conversations with both Roberto and Sultan forever, but I leave the floor for questions.